Hi, everyone. Welcome to Votebeat's event for today, Midway to Midterms. I am really excited to have with me Tiana Epps Johnson, the founder and executive director for the Center of Tech and Civic Life, which works to make sure that U.S. elections are more inclusive and secure, and also Trey Grayson, who served as a two-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky and now works as a managing director of Frost Todd Brown's government relations affiliate, Civic Point. And we are going to be talking today about the lessons that these folks learned during the 2020 election that should inform the elections that are happening right now, and also the elections happening more specifically in 2022. So Tiana, Trey, thanks so much for being here with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me too.
Well, I want to get started and direct kind of a broad question to both of you. So I hope you'll kind of entertain me, take this whatever direction you like. But you both were working in the election space, right? Supporting the election during the 2020 election, and I want to hear from you what the major threats that emerged in 2020 that concern you still for 2022, perhaps the ones that we have not addressed in a head-on fashion. Tiana, do you want to go first? All right,
there
Trey,
we go.
There we go. Okay.
Naturally, couldn't get myself off of mute. Yeah, so it goes without saying that the 2020 election cycle was like nothing that I think election officials and folks that support election officials have experienced before. And I think that there are a number of threats that were new to 2020 or that were exacerbated in 2020 that still are clearly on the horizon to impact elections as we go into 2022. I'll touch on a couple of them, and I anticipate these are going to be themes throughout the entire conversation that we have. Very first on my mind is the fact that we see that in communities across the country, election officials are the targets of threats and harassment and other forms of abuse for simply showing up to their jobs with integrity. And we've seen really excellent research by places like the California Voter Foundation, which has released a report called Documenting and Addressing Harassment of Election Officials that has done in-depth interviews with folks, and the range of things that election officials are facing are everything from death threats to in-person intimidation and stalking to threats of violence in person, and the impact of that are election officials that are experiencing trauma and stress and anxiety, all while fearful for what is going to happen for the future of elections and trying to continue to project real strength. And so there are a lot of consequences of that. And one of them is that election officials are, getting weary, and they have been doing this for, 2 straight years now without much of a break, and are going into another election cycle where it feels unrelenting. So that is top of mind. A couple other themes are that we right now are in a crisis of confidence. Disinformation has taken hold in a really distinct way. We're still in a COVID election environment. We still need to be thinking about precautions to keep voters safe as they go to the polls as we get into 2022. And, really top of my mind and the mind of folks at the Center for Tech and Civic Life is that elections continue to get more complex without commensurate funding or additional staffing capacity at the local level to help election officials to easily meet these challenges. And so we see election officials continue over and over again to do heroic work, but the fact that they have to do heroic work, I think, is a systems failure. Election officials should have what they need to be able to serve the voters adequately without having to run through walls and face harassment to be able to do this really critical piece of our democracy.
Trey, I bet you'd agree with a lot of what Tiana just said, but I know that you've also been on the inside of this, right? You've helped Kentucky run a whole state election. So I would love to sort of hear you add on what Tiana said based on your kind of on the ground experience previously, and then also, the work that you did to support election administrators this past year.
Sure. And thanks, Tiana, for not listing everything. You left me a few things to add, but I agree with everything that you said. I'll start off with that. A couple more that I would add is, is the growing partisanship that, and I'll start with, I'm a Republican. My party's worse, way worse. We had a president try to, subvert the will of the voters. So I'm not gonna equate, but there is a both sides here. We've seen both political parties ramp up the partisanship and in mobilizing their voters. Hey, the other side's going to cheat, the other side's going to suppress. We can talk later where that's actually effective messaging to mobilize your voters. I'm not sure that behavioral science would say it is, but we're seeing both sides doing that. And that is, so they're both sort of indirectly, going back to Tiana's comment about undermining the confidence in our elections. They're both doing it. We've seen a lot of legislation proposed, some of it being passed in the last year. Early on this year, a lot of the headlines were about, changes to vote by mail, early voting, things like that. I mean, we can disagree about how many weekends of early voting and the exact, some of those I think are within the realms of policy debate. But some of the more problematic elements of these legislation is giving legislators more control over the certification process as opposed to voters and vote counters and vote certifiers the way we have traditionally done it. And that sets the stage for future battles when it comes time to determine who wins and loses. And so those kinds of laws, I think, to me, are the most concerning. And then I guess the last thing, and I alluded a little bit, but Trump's fascination, obsession, whatever you want to use to describe it. I mean, even last night, he I guess he doesn't tweet. He released a statement that I read on Twitter, in which he basically, continued to call
Funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah, rigged and the biggest crime against humanity, and why would Republicans go out and vote in 2022 and 2024? And it's like every day he seems to be obsessed with all of this, and there's so much downstream impact of that. We've seen it with the ballot reviews in Arizona, the ongoing ballot reviews in Wisconsin and some other states, the pushes in Texas to do one of these reviews. And so, Tiana made a great point. We're almost a year. Well, we've been voting over a year ago. People were voting in last year's presidential election, and we're still, because of the former president's comments and actions and his support inside the Republican Party, we're still debating and dealing with the last election. We're not preparing, and I don't see Trump giving that up. And given the level of support he is perceived to have inside the Republican Party right now, we see a lot of Republican leaders like Congressman Scalise, who's in House Republican leadership, who just the other day wasn't able to kind of call out what really happened in last year's election. So those are just a few more things I would add to the list.
Ah, what a wonderful and cheerful picture we've painted for our participants today. So, one of the reasons that I wanted to include both of your voices in this panel is because I talked to both of you as I was working on my story a couple of months ago about, Nancy Pelosi's failure to include election funding into the bipartisan infrastructure package, and then again into the reconciliation package, and how disappointing that was for election administrators across the country. And one of the conversations I had with both of you around that was sort of about how we connect for voters and for our audiences. The idea that funding and confidence and funding and the appropriate administration of elections and funding and the ability to mass enfranchise people are directly connected, right? We can no longer we can't get any more blood out of this stone, sort of. And I wonder, I'd like to hear from Tiana about this, because, you run a whole organization that part of its main advocacy is sort of getting this funding to people that need it. How do you navigate that space? How do you convince people who are voting rights activists or voting security activists that the principle of election administration and election administration funding would actually directly support both of their causes?
Yeah, I think that it's really helpful to start with some context about how elections are currently resourced. It might be a refresher for a lot of you, but I think that this is an area where there's a lot for the public to learn and for advocates to learn about how the sort of sausage gets made. In the US, we have a super decentralized election system. There's the nearly 8,000 election jurisdictions, each with a ton of their independent responsibility, pretty minimal support for all figuring out how to make voting work within their particular state and local law. And election departments receive state and federal funding, but their annual budgets generally largely come from their local tax base. And research has shown that the average portion of a county budget spent on election operations is about 0.5%. So that means that the budget is not only a very small percent of the county's priorities, but it's also sort of the amount of funding for an election department, and by extension, the quality of someone's voting experience might vary significantly based on how wealthy or impoverished the local tax base is. And keep in mind that, like, regardless of where you are, that funding has to be stretched at the local level to do year-round work, everything from making sure that voter registration lists are accurate, to ensuring the logistics of voting goes off without a hitch, to defending systems from hostile state actors. These are all things that local election departments are responsible for doing. So, if we have annual budgets and then this occasional infusion of significant federal funding, but not on a regular, predictable basis and not at the scale of the need, what we're seeing is, as a result, a real stress on the basic infrastructure of our elections. When it comes to the type of technology that election departments are using, a survey that was done in 2019 by the AP found that the vast majority of election departments use equipment with Windows 7 or older operating systems to create things like ballots and program voting machines and tally votes. Windows 7 was released in 2009. So technology from over a decade ago that is past the end of its life is used right now to support literal critical infrastructure. So taking all of this together, just to sort of talk directly to the question, under-resourcing election departments contributes to mistrust and a poor voter experience in a variety of ways, from election departments without enough staff to be able to inform voters about how voting works and break through that mis and disinformation that right now is at the heart of this crisis of confidence that we're in, to equipment that's difficult for election officials and voters to use that can contribute to a negative voting experience, meaning that folks might not come back or might be disenfranchised in the first place. And we're super fortunate that 2020 was an election that was proven to be secure, but outdated equipment is super vulnerable to cyber attacks. And one of my worst nightmares is seeing one of these malware attacks, happen to an election department during election time. You can only imagine what type of impact that might have on the public. And these are the types of things that we can mitigate for if we are actually resourcing elections properly.
And Trey, I would love to get your take on this as well. I mean, I'm hoping you can kind of bring this down even more into reality for us. Can you think of a time during your years helping elections go in the United States, a situation in which you had to convince folks to pay for something that they didn't really want to pay for, even though they wanted the outcome that would arrive as a result of that spending?
Well, I jokingly refer to my time when I was secretary as the Stone Ages. It was in the 2000s. It was the heyday, of voting. We were dealing with the aftermath of the 2000 presidential election and implementation of the Help America Vote Act. And embarrassingly, some of the voting systems that we helped to fund when I was in office are still in use in Kentucky, to Tiana's point about some of the age and some of the resources. And, one of the challenges is again, the funding is at the state and local level has been consistently low.
Yeah.
The federal government has only funded a few times. 3 times has there been any federal dollars. One was a big chunk of money for the Help America Vote Act after the 2000 election, which states and locals kind of spent down. I realize they haven't spent it all down, but spent most of that down over, in the 2000s. There was a chunk of money in reaction.
I want to pause you right there, though, just because that's like a really stunning thing to consider. And I think that politicians have spun it in a way that is not necessarily accurate, right? They say like, well, why should we give them more money? They haven't even spent the HAVA money, but right, the base truth for why the money hasn't been spent is because you don't know when you're getting more of it, right?
Right, no, that's exactly.
it's a cyclical problem, right? I just want to highlight that for our
no,
audience.
that's exactly right. So, we got that chunk of money. You want to spend it down intelligently because it's one-time money. And then in 2019, right before the pandemic, there was some money that was quasi, it's sort of earmarked with some soft restrictions to security. And that took a couple of years, and it was a bipartisan push to recognize that, okay, we learned in the 2016 election that our voting system is at the front lines of national security. And you would see interesting coalitions. I remember speaking at a panel in Washington with Common Cause and FreedomWorks, on the same panel, advocating for federal money. And FreedomWorks would say, well, we don't like government, we want limited government, but we think national security is an important role of government, and so we want elections to be funded. And then there's another chunk of money with the CARES Act to help election administrators pivot in 2020 to pay for, states like Kentucky that we're not planning to do, 100% vote by mail in a primary, for example, and didn't budget for the postage. And so, but it is irregularly funded. Congress, I think, because of the national security standpoint, ought to have a regular amount of money. And it's fine if it's lower, but if you can predict it, then you can make your capital investments. You can also go to the state legislators and say, look, this is all we're getting. We need more. You can go to your county and city governments. We need more. But it has been cash trapped. A couple other things where this shows up is poll worker pay. We always have a hard time getting enough poll workers. We essentially call them volunteers because the reality is that's what they are, given how little they're paid. And because we don't have a lot of money in the system, we're having to pay poll workers so little. They get very poor training, and they are the front lines. At the end of the day, election administrators go to bed the night before the election, if they actually go to bed the night before the election. But the time they go to bed before an election,
I don't. I never go to bed the night before.
Yeah, you do the prayer of large margins, and you also do the prayer that your poll workers show up that morning, and because they're the one that's how the voter has that experience is that particular interaction with that poll worker. And so and also the voting systems, if we had more consistent money, maybe we'd have better voting systems, because there would be a marketplace that the vendors would know, oh, we could invest in R&D because then we can get it back. Whereas right now these vendors don't really know. And then Congress throws money, and then we buy machines that are already out of date. That's what happened with HAVA. We bought all these machines that were not all that secure. Maybe, they were better than punch cards, I guess. Except for the fact that a punch card, you could go back and look at it. It wasn't an ephemeral electronic vote. And so it really is it's a crazy way to fund the most important thing in a democracy, which is our election.
It is really interesting because you mentioned that elections are a national security problem. We've in fact labeled them critical infrastructure, but those two dots have not seemed to connect necessarily for the people who are in charge of funding elections, right? We'll spend $17 million on a warship we never use, but $2 million for elections, excuse me.
If I could add one thing, I meant to say this, that now Congress will say back to states and locals, look, we let you all make your own decisions and run your own elections. So you can pay for it. That's the price. You want us to pay for it, we might take more control, because that's what Congress does. And so that was sort of the rationale historically. It was, okay, elections are a local and state function, so therefore it should be paid at the state and local level, and we're not going to put any money in. But we've seen after 2000, after 2016, and then in a pandemic, Congress stepped up, and I just think the security argument is going to win the day ultimately to provide some funding, because there's too much bipartisan support, and it really does make sense. And these states and locals need the help. They need the help from the federal government to be that front line of the national security.
If it's okay,
please.
Highlight just how much support there is for the idea of bolstering election infrastructure across the country. There's been surveying done that shows that there's about 80% support among bipartisan support among people for investing in election infrastructure. And so this is something that we launched a campaign in partnership with election officials across the country. And, it's rare that election officials advocate for something, even including funding for elections. But this was something that was so critical and so non-political, but just basic to the critical infrastructure of elections, that we saw election officials come together, over 250 from states across the country, all to raise their hand and say, this is really critically important to how I do my work every day. And we're just not seeing that type of consensus around any issues. But this one is one where it's really clear that not only are the stakes really high, not only is it really important, but this is also something where there's broad common sense support for it.
And I want to stay with this for just a second, Tiana, because what you said just a second ago, where it's rare to see election administrators of both party advocate in such unison about an issue. And that has occurred to me over the last year. I've been covering this for a while. You've been in this space for a while. I have not yet seen, or at least until now, election administrators actively wanting to speak out. I mean, usually this is a behind the scenes role. They're happy to play, and that is what they want. This year is the first year I've seen sort of full-throated activism on the part of election administrators. And I wonder if it's because, this year we had funding problems that were obviously compounded by the pandemic. But as the years started to wear on, we also started to see people leave their jobs. And I wonder if you heard election administrators talk to you about how impactful that was in terms of the lack of ability to retain good staff or keep election administrators in place. How top of mind has that become for folks?
That is, I would say, one of the biggest concerns to my mind as we look to 22 and 24. We, just talked about the sort of weight of the threats and harassment that election officials are facing. We talked about the working conditions that basically make them have to make ends meet. And so right now, even though election officials are doing work every day that's critically important, it's really rough work. And it's exacerbated, that puts pressure on folks to consider whether or not it's worth it to stay every day to do something, even though they care really deeply about it. And that's exacerbated by the field already being at retirement age. The Stewards of Democracy research, found that 74% of chief election officials are over the age of 50, a quarter are over the age of 65. So that means, even if there weren't these pressures on election officials, that we were already going to be on the precipice of a big turnover of the staff in election departments. And so, right now we're at this moment where we're on this brink of this massive shift of the makeup of who staffs our elections, and potentially at this big loss of critical institutional knowledge. And we're also right now in a current culture of election administration where we see election officials at the local level really stand up as public servants who are overwhelmingly approaching their work as implementers of voting laws and procedures, mostly being behind the scenes, like you mentioned, speaking out occasionally, but really approaching their work with a duty to do it in a way that's aggressively nonpartisan. And I think that there's real reason to be concerned that without concerted effort to really maintain that culture, that we could see a next generation of election officials who are not as committed to the norms of nonpartisanship, and that could have real range of consequences from maladministration to further eroding public confidence.
Okay. And I wonder, Trey, if you think that there are specific steps that we should be taking to help protect election officials or give them, obviously it is beyond the capability of all three of us to give them $10 billion in election funding, but I'm wondering if
that one, right? Boom.
Listen, if I could write a check, I would do it. I wonder if there are immediate and sort of less gigantic steps that we should be taking right now to support election administrators who are facing this type of work environment to sort of ensure that they have at least the emotional support to continue doing what they're doing.
I can think of a couple. One is a Band-Aid that's already happening, which is the Bob Bauer, Ben Ginsburg effort to offer free legal assistance if it's ever needed by any election officials. For those who, most people in this group probably know, but I'll just as a refresher, Bob Bauer was President Obama's elections lawyer and also his general counsel or White House counsel during the first part of his administration. Ben Ginsburg was George W. Bush and Mitt Romney's elections lawyer. And after the 2012 election, the president appointed them to chair a commission on which I served to examine how to improve elections after 2012. So we dealt with those issues, and a lot of that got implemented. It was a very successful effort. So they teamed up again, this time on their own. No president asked them to do this. No former president asked them to do this, to get together or put together a network of folks who would be willing to offer legal representation to election administrators who get sued. And sometimes we know that county governments either, again, don't have the resources or the county attorney's busy doing other things. And so that's just getting started, but that's a Band-Aid. I think the other thing that we can really focus on is trying to, reach out to different coalitions. So one of the things that has been helpful in some of these state legislative battles on some of the laws is engaging allies like the business community to step in. I was involved in some of those conversations, and in Georgia, frankly, the business community helped shape that bill, where it still didn't end up where it ought to have been, but it was way better than it could have been, and the business community played a real important role behind the scenes. And we're now seeing, and behind the scenes conversations, and I think we're going to see this more publicly over the next few months, the broader business community stepping up to say, again, we might disagree on what's the best way to vote, but we can all agree that we shouldn't interfere with the certification process. We shouldn't criminalize election professionals. We need to provide that level of support. And so I think that sort of those allies and in the business community and other places and other allies that are not traditionally involved in this debate, I think those are important folks. I mean, let's say even if we didn't have the sort of the Donald Trump and his efforts to discredit the last election in a pandemic, this is still a challenging time for election administrators, because so many jurisdictions are transitioning, and this is happening all across the country at various speeds, to voting not just on election day unless you have an excuse. And along that way, it's a challenge because you don't exactly know. You can't predict how quickly the voters are going to adopt these new methods, which means you have to keep the same number of polling places open and the same number of poll workers, and you have to overorder ballots and machines and things like that. And so in the short run, it's really more work until you get to that sort of equilibrium. And if you're you can capture those efficiencies if you know what it's going to be. But in the short run, you don't know it's going to be, and so all that stress is still there, and that we would be still having a conversation about how hard this is if we didn't have a pandemic, a Trump factor, and you can go back to 2016, a national security, cybersecurity factor.
Absolutely. And speaking of cybersecurity, I'd love to pivot into the field now occupied by cyber ninjas, the audit space, right? But I think that presently this is a huge concern I'm hearing from election officials who are like, I don't know that I can keep doing this with this crazy stuff happening around me. I'm wondering if Trey, you can talk a little bit about what concerns you, right? Like you hinted at this earlier, you're a Republican, like it is your party that is sort of going down this path. And what does it feel like to look down at that from 10,000 feet?
Yeah, it's frustrating. Many people may know that I co-wrote a report with University of Wisconsin political science professor Barry Burden back in June, where we saw the recount part of the Cyber Ninjas audit, and we identified a whole host of problems, from lack of transparency and contracting and not using best practices, not having any experts, a lot of basically everything you could do wrong, they were doing wrong. The hope was, one, to shed a light on it, probably to raise doubts about whatever it is that they produce because you couldn't trust it, but also to stop the domino effect, to stop other states from doing something similar. And unfortunately, we seem to have failed, because I'm watching a similar kinds of issues befall Wisconsin in their effort. They hired a former judge, and so okay, right, it doesn't know elections, but judges,
they should know the law.
Should know the law and know to hire experts, and no. And then we're also seeing it never ending, so it has been problematic. Now, I will say this little caveat. I mean, I think it's okay to ask questions. I think, when I was secretary, after every election, I went before the legislature and we talked about the good and the bad, and they asked me questions. And so some of this is, there's one positive aspect of all this is, there's now a Votebeat. There's now every major media outlet has somebody who's on the elections beat and is understanding how election administrations actually work and is covering it. And I think that'll help the general public. The general public's asking some really good questions, but unfortunately, things like the Cyber Ninjas audit are not designed to build confidence or trust in the system or to educate voters. Instead, they're designed to basically lay the groundwork for future distrust with elections. And let me give you an example of how something that the Cyber Ninjas report did, where you could have turned it around and actually turned it into a positive tool. So at the end, when the report was issued, there were a series of anomalies, or potential anomalies, I think was the phrase that they used, where they went through and identified, there appeared to be too many extra images on the ballot, and there were too many, those kinds of things. what if you approach that by saying, okay, if I'm just a random citizen and I see that there's more ballot images than ballot cast, what is the rationale for that? And if I explained it in that way and said, you'd see this and you might think there's a problem. Oh, well, here's why that's not anything to be worried about. Here's this, and here's the safeguard we have here, and this. It could have been a really good teaching moment for the legislature. It could have been really a good teaching moment for the general public. Instead, it was, perceived anomalies and things like that. And so I like to point that out because I think that again, we ought to be transparent. We ought to be able to answer questions. And then the last thing I'd say is it's never ending. There's this Texas bill, which I'm not sure where it stands. I think it passed the Senate, but it's not clear the governor has allowed it to be called, but will basically allow anybody to request an audit for like 2 years, as long as the materials still exist. I mean, that was the functional, there is not a statute of limitations, but after 22 months, the materials are gone. So you could like walk in the day before the next year's election, say, I want an audit and I want it now.
And then you'd get it.
And then you'd get it. And then if you didn't get it, there might be a fine. I mean, it's like, and then like what's crazy to me as a Republican, I'm like, Democrats are going to do this too. And they're going to really annoy you. And it's like, why, this is so insane. That we're doing this. It's so short-sighted and it's just really bad policy. And so all that is exacerbating and hopefully the reviews will stop in these kind of battleground states, these 4, 5, 6 states. But I do worry. I mean, we have crazies going around Kentucky saying Trump should have won by more.
Right.
Doing info sessions. And so I'm sure that's going on in all kinds of other states.
Absolutely. I mean, Tiana, do you think that this is ever going to end? I mean, you talk to election administrators every day. Do they have the same sense of like never-ending doom that Trey seems to have?
I have to agree that right now it's a real hard time to see the light at the end of the tunnel because folks are doubling down on these wild claims. And I also agree though with Trey that like there is a huge opportunity here, or one of the biggest opportunities that we've had ever to really educate the public and the media and elected officials about how election administration, like different than election law, but election administration actually works. In my experience, I have really, come up close and personal with the challenge when people don't understand how elections work in practice. One of our programs last year included providing grants to election departments across the country to allow them to use funds to be able to make their elections safe for voters. And one of the critiques that we heard was that election departments, used a fraction of it on PPE. But then they used it for other things that folks said was out of the scope, like vehicles or vote by mail or communicating with voters. And, if you really are grounded in how election administration works, then you understand that, vote by mail was available so that folks could avoid gathering in person so that we wouldn't have a super spreader event, or that doing voter registration was critical last year because there were limited opportunities for people to register to vote because the pandemic closed a lot of those opportunities. Raising pay for election workers was one of the most important things to avoid a catastrophe on election day, because we saw primaries where election departments, were only able to open 5 of their 180 polling places in places like Milwaukee. And that was because election workers, were in advanced age and particularly vulnerable to the pandemic. And so funds were critical for that. And one of my favorite questions is like, what do election departments use vehicles for? Well, equipment doesn't teleport itself to polling places. So that was
ballots in arms. Running down the highway.
Jan, if we just connected the voting systems to the internet, then we wouldn't need the vehicles. We could.
I think the answer is series of just like mnemonic bank tubes through the city. I think that would be great. And
there was in Bristol County, Virginia. A brilliant election official at the beginning of the pandemic was incredibly resourceful, and she used the bank system drive-through window and the pneumatic tubes to be able to serve voters before there were more advanced technology. So fun fact.
Oh my God. Like never fails. Okay, I want to ask Trey if you could just answer this reader question or this listener question real quick, and then I'm going to turn it over to Allison Go, our Chief Strategy Officer, so that she can talk to y'all more about Votebeat and what we're doing right now. But this is from Kurt, and he says that Ben Ginsburg, who you referenced, Trey, recently argued in the Washington Post that we shouldn't be afraid of these audits because they probably won't find anything. And like, you know, I realize we have an N of 1 here with Arizona, but they didn't. So do you think that that's valid, or are we missing something?
What's hard, I mean, I read Ben's column and I think I find always been really compelling. I mean, what's hard is, if I can separate the review that was done in New Hampshire and the one at the, whatever the county was, and the jurisdiction, and the one in Ameren County, Michigan, that were productive, well-intentioned. I mean, I think Ben's point is, look, they tried the clown show audit in Arizona. They couldn't find anything. They're just going to keep doing this, and eventually it'll fade away. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the part of the challenge is that Trump just doesn't seem to be fading away, and the demands keep getting greater and greater. And I don't see, I was hoping after Arizona didn't show anything, or as Ben put it, they tried really hard and they couldn't even spin Arizona into win, but yet the president still is, spinning it into wins. I respectfully disagree with Ben on this, but as long as somebody's right and this gets better, then maybe I hope he's right in that respect. But but the larger point of not being afraid, I mean, I'm not afraid of these. But if we find something, then we should fix it. And I'm not afraid of facing up to a mistake or a bad policy or a bad procedure. And we shouldn't be. We should accept constructive criticism. And it might be out of this effort we do find something good. That I know in Arizona, Maricopa County, they're trying to look at, okay, they went through all this. What are the lessons that they can offer up to to try to make it better, to build more confidence? And that's a productive approach.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. I would like to invite Allison on to just tell y'all a little bit more about Votebeat in a way that will be more elucidating than what I can offer. So Allison, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, so much. So first of all, Allison Go. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Chalkbeat, I guess the owner of Votebeat, or the kind of umbrella company over Votebeat, and also co-founder of Votebeat. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of background on Votebeat. We are a nonprofit newsroom covering local election administration and voting. Votebeat was created almost exactly a year ago, hence the anniversary title, and in the middle of a historic election, which was in the middle of a pandemic. So a crazy time. At the time, we created Votebeat as a pop-up. It was an experiment to journalistically meet the moment. What we learned, though, and what all of us know now, is that the story, of course, didn't end on election day. So for the last several months, we've been working with Jessica and a small team to continue the work of reporting and informing on this critical topic. Now, our plan is to grow, and in particular, we want to place more local reporters on the ground where the action is happening. So on our list are states like Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Michigan, and so on. The short list is not so short, it's pretty long, and so we have great ambitions to be in as many places as possible. So as I mentioned earlier, Votebeat is a nonprofit, and we need your support and the support of the community to continue to grow and do this work. So of course, there's an ask. If you can, please donate to Votebeat, which you can do on our site, votebeat.org, or via the emails we'll be sending you after this event. And if you know others who would be interested, please spread the word. We're so grateful for new readers, for new intros, for new ideas. So that's it for the business part of the event. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And I'm gonna throw it back to Jessica and the panelists. Thanks much.
Thanks, Allison. I appreciate it. Okay, so I just have a couple of quick more questions, and then we will let everybody get back to their evenings with their families. The first thing that I would love to hear from you guys, and I'd love to answer, I would love both of you to answer this. We'll start with Tiana and then go to Trey, is what role election administrators have in restoring confidence, right? I feel, as somebody who talks to them all the time, that there are very few people talking directly to election administrators. People are mostly getting their messaging from legislators or from activists in the space, which, as we've seen, can be less than productive. How do they make their voices heard? How do they advocate for this confidence directly?
I'll throw a couple ideas out, and I'm sure Tiana can beat them and offer some better ones. But I'll start with one is to be accessible. There's a great story that Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose shared with me in Hamilton County, which is the county where Cincinnati, Ohio is located. And I live right across the river from that part of Ohio, in what we call Northern Kentucky. And there were some local Republicans who had some concerns about the last year's election. And so the Secretary of State got with the Hamilton County Board of Elections, which is a bipartisan sort of government entity that runs the elections there, walked them around, gave them a tour, explained what they do on election night, how they count the votes, how they certify the equipment, that sort of thing. And at the end, the folks signed up to be poll workers. I don't think they were part of the plants that Steve Bannon's trying to get poll workers to maybe undermine the system. I think they genuinely were impressed with what was going on, and they heard the pitch that they were needed. And so for many, not all, because we see some of the bad actors on social media, but I think for many Americans, they just have some questions. And so when you have that opportunity to engage, I would seize it. The second thing is, it probably wouldn't hurt to write up a little something with sort of the top lines, what you do to certify, to make sure that elections are secure. Just a few things that people don't know. That we certify the machines in the front end, there's ballot reconciliation, that there's a piece of paper. We are so much further along today voting on paper than we were even 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago. So we have the ability to do audits. We have the ability to do those kinds of recounts. It's also a deterrent. And so I think just sort of those sort of big picture things, and then probably a little bit about some of the list maintenance that goes on to keep dead people from voting, and all the protections that exist to make sure that that list is accurate. I think getting that message out, putting a little column in a local media outlet, going on a little bit of a speaking tour, go to your local civic groups and things like that. I think that wouldn't hurt. I realize they're pressed for time, and a lot of times they have other duties. But now's probably the time to be a little bit more proactive, a little bit more out front, and it probably will pay dividends.
I couldn't agree more with what Trey shared. I think that right now there could be a tendency, especially in an environment of threats and harassment, for election officials to become more insular. But I think this is a really excellent opportunity for election officials actually to open themselves up more to engaging directly with folks in their communities, even if at this moment it feels challenging, because there are so many folks, really a majority of folks, that are supportive of the values that election officials are out there striving to uphold all the time. I love the example that Trey shared. It reminds me of another one. I was just talking with some of our advisors, and one of them who leads elections in Forsyth County, North Carolina, just had an election academy where he invited folks from the community, particularly folks that were really concerned about the integrity of the election and were casting doubts on whether or not it was adequately administered. Invited those folks in for this training program. And he said by the end of it, there's about a dozen folks that came. He said about 10 of them were converts to believing and really trusting the process. And it was something new that he hadn't tried before, but it really paid off. And so I think that there are more opportunities for that kind of engagement. And I think that the other thing is that it's going to take partnerships with messengers beyond just election officials and election departments to be able to effectively reach voters. Election officials are some of the most trusted messengers that we have in government, but not everybody is going to listen to their election administrator to really change their mind or even be open to what folks have to say. But there is someone in the community that they might, and those identifying groups and the media outlets and other partners that can be an extension of your office, and really focusing on how to raise their understanding of your process is one of the most important things election officials can do, so that can expand their network to be able to amplify the really important information that they have to share with the public.
One way they could do that, I think that's a great idea that Tiana just mentioned, is we have, in most cases, we have partisanship or bipartisanship baked in. There's usually local boards of elections with Republicans and Democrats. And so having those Republican and Democratic volunteers, or in some cases, they're actually paid employees, go together. It's sort of like the local example of, Bauer and Ginsburg together saying, all right, everybody knows that we're hardcore partisans. We're the lawyers that you hire when you've got a big elections contest or recount, but we agree on certain things. And having, at the state level and at the local level, the folks who are involved, that can amplify those election officials' voices. So just wanted to give that example of what the point Tiana was making.
Thank you so much. Well, we are right up at time. I am so thankful for your participation, Tiana and Trey. This was wonderful. And I'm sure that I'll be bothering you again before like the end of next week. So appreciation in advance for that. And thanks so much for the folks at home that tuned in on what I'm sure was otherwise a busy Thursday to talk about elections and democracy. Please sign up for Votebeat's newsletter. It goes out on Saturdays, so you still have time to get our edition for this week. It will be about the Texas audit. Just a shameless plug there if you want to learn more about that. And we will see you next time we do one of these. I appreciate it, guys.